Okay. So I believe I'm the last presentation of the day. So I hope you can stay awake. uh, Hello, I'm Robert Foley. I work for Acquia. I'm a technical architect. This talk, as the title shows, we're going to be talking about features strategy, structured development, and deployment. So a quick little overview of who I am. As I said, I work for Acquia. I'm a technical architect. Been there since around 2013. Been using Drupal since around 2007, so Drupal 5, Drupal 6-ish in that point on. Worked in the industry since 1997. I've worked in C# and .NET, Java, J2EE, and many, many, many languages and libraries. So I guess to start off, how many of you have used features? Yay, a large percentage. And I'll just assume you've also built features since you've used them. How many have made custom modules? Yeah. So here's a loaded question. How many of you have had problems working with teams when using features? Okay. So basically, here's the overview of what I'm going to talk about today. Try to get through all of it with the time that we have. Even though you've all known features, I promise I got one slide just to give an overview of what features is. And then we'll go into more specific strategies. So first we'll have the brief overview. We'll talk about the structuring of features and concepts behind that. Then we'll step back a little and go a little higher level on how you can look at features as classifications of feature types and how they can work together. And then based on that knowledge, we'll then talk about workflow, feature foundations, perhaps even get into how you can use this framework to do deployments and rollbacks and change management. So just 2 slides on this, I promise. What are features? So let's look about before features. What was it like? Teams wrote custom modules. Many of them were one-off. From one team member to the next, it's kind of a mixed bag if they're similar or not. Worse yet, once you've got those modules finished and you're getting ready to deploy that out into an environment for your developers or for a staging environment or production environment, you might have to get a lot of business folk involved and have them go through the process of setting up your environment again because you didn't have a way to deploy that in a consistent manner. So that's the past. That's some of the impetus for why the community moved towards wanting to implement features. So what are features from a very high level? I like to say that it's structured data. That includes configuration, settings, some content, but generally that's not its focus. But what it does is it provides a standard for integration, and it allows you to encapsulate those configurations and settings into code so that it's reliable and you can distribute it in a manner other than having to reload a database dump. So I tried to provide some examples on the right-hand side. Global settings, module settings, entity definitions, field definitions, so forth and so on, behaviors, encapsulating rules, and or specific configuration and or elements that might be encapsulated in a contrib module. So that's the 10,000-foot view. Yeah, I got that. I kind of, we'll talk about that. So with that very brief Features 101, let's talk about structured features. There's many things to consider with your features and how you're encapsulating these configurations and structures. When looking at how you're going to define your features, you need to, I think that they're most beneficial when you're dealing with teams of more than 2 people. Certainly, as an individual, as the site author or the architect, features are invaluable to help you package up your information. But when you're dealing with more people on your project, it gets more dispersed. As you get 4, 8 people on your project, features become more invaluable in helping you with not just structuring your code, but providing a means to manage workflow and resources. So features also provide this notion of consistency. And this will help you with your initial releases as well as any future releases and or updates as you move forward on your particular project and or site. So some of this might be just rehashing everything we just talked about. So it provides a level of modularity. They provide a way for you to create sets of features based on a particular set of modules and or configuration. And in some cases, when defining your features, you want to reduce the number of interdependencies between them. I'll explain that. So I thought, what's the best way to illustrate this? And so I created this fictitious cookie monster company. Out of this company, they want to list out recipes, the ingredients, perhaps have chefs write out reviews of these different types of products that they're selling. Maybe they have some additional rules for having one user, head chefs, be able to approve and or decline particular reviews and or recipes. And maybe the site, which I'm not going to cover all of these feature sets, but maybe the site wants to allow visitors to rate those cookies. So based on this concept, where do we start? Looking at the objects that are inside of Drupal, you've got your content types, your taxonomies, user profiles, media asset, configuration data, just in general. These are all just general things which features allows you to encapsulate. From that, you can start to identify objects that reinforce those business requirements that the client stated. An example of that is we need recipes. Those recipes may have details, may have an index. Client had stated they wanted to specify color and ingredients for that recipe. Some of this is pretty mundane since everyone's probably already used them before, but bear with me. Once you have that, then it's important to determine how you're going to structure those. And this is where we get into the more nitty-gritty things about modeling. In Drupal 8, it's going to be much more important, your namespacing and how you name things. In 7, it's still applicable, and it applies to when you're creating your feature, which is a module, just like any other module. When you're defining your functions, when you're defining your variables, those names are going to inherit the namespace of that feature. So not only from the concept of making it easy to understand when another developer goes to look at your feature, it's important that it also reinforces this concept of being able to split out your model into reusable features that have some form of relativity to them. And what I mean by that, so here we looked at modeling the recipe, the color, and the ingredient. I provided an example of here's what the feature would be named for each of these different elements. Some school of thought is, well, I want to put that all into one big feature. It's the recipe feature. Why do I need to have everything separated out? Well, it's hard to anticipate the intended uses of every single piece of the system that you're going to have for that feature. So splitting them out provides you two advantages. One is the opportunity to replace it out with something else or to revise it without affecting the feature structure as a whole or the content. And this is especially important once you have authors creating content on that environment. You can't just go into your feature and change the fields that are being used or the specific display without having some kind of repercussions, both on your data as well as your structure. So having them defined as I've kind of illustrated here, we've got the recipe itself. The naming convention that I advocate is either defining a title based on the particular project you're on, or there's an acronym that makes the most sense from a business point of view. You use that as your suffix or your prefix, sorry. And then as you outline your features, such as, so this client is cookie. It's just my example. I'm going to have prefix of cookie and recipe for the first feature. And that would encapsulate the content type, its field definitions, and perhaps the content type's configuration. Separately, you would implement for the different taxonomies, color, ingredients. You could have cookie color, cookie ingredients. For the displays, I advocate having them separated out simply because those displays, while they might be simple when you first start, could become extremely complex and encapsulate a lot of information, such as you could have your panel layouts, you could have custom displays. All of those things become noise if they're inside of the main recipe feature. And they become, they're decoupled, so they're easy to replace and or remove. Simply on the notion that features are modules, you can turn them off, turn them on, you can update them. So having them separated out makes it better for you in the long run. And many of these concepts are just that. They're concepts. They're not hard, fast rules. They're guidelines. And so I challenge you to just put them to the test. As you go through a project and you're modeling out these, think about having them separate out in pieces, and you probably will see that as you're working with your team, that it makes it more flexible and makes it easier for you to maintain over time. So I kind of went over all these just by giving you a description. Yeah. So this is kind of the gist of what I just said. Sorry, I jumped ahead. Sure.
So if we're looking at a site that has 20, 30 content types, 3 or 4 secondary integrations, like that with the features.
Could you speak up?
Let's say a site has 20 or 30 content types.
Sure.
Each content type is 3 or 4 display nodes. Are we talking about 60 million different feature modules?
Well, you'd have to determine their purpose. So if you've got multiple, say you've got a box content type, that box content type is going to have several different displays for the detail of that content. Either that's going to be the teaser, that's going to be the details page, and maybe there's a showcase. I could see it being rational to have those in a single feature versus if it's something that's going to be in listings that you're going to have on the site. Say you've got, so if you look at that box widget, if you want, is going to be sold on an e-commerce site, it makes more sense to have a separate feature for the listings of that particular type of content being separate, where it could eventually encapsulate a lot more sophistication, business sophistication and technical sophistication, and having them tightly coupled could be a quagmire, especially if you wanted to separate, say, just for the details. You've got your back-end architect building the content type, then you have your individual displays. Having them separated out, even with that box and the displays, means that your front-end developers can work on that module and extend that feature and not be held up by anything that might be going on with the main content type. And that may change over time. So the team can focus on implementing update hooks and changes in a segmented way, even though they're interrelated and dependent on each other. Hope that helped explain it. So I kind of touched on this when I was describing the different data objects and naming conventions. These naming conventions will definitely become more apparent when we start working in Drupal 8. But even before taking that as a consideration, the naming conventions I think are important even in Drupal 7. I provided in the slide, which you'll be able to download, a link to Drupal's naming standards. I'm not going to go over all of them, but they're pretty detailed in giving you what the community has recommended for naming conventions, as well as the core of Drupal for 7 and 8 follow the same conventions. Let's see. So I've said this a couple times, but I'll just reiterate again. Since features is a module, your team can use that feature. Usually what we do is we'll implement that initial feature rather quickly, just generating it with the features tool. At that point, then we'll start to implement additional hooks and extensions to that feature based on the business and or technical requirements for the project. So it's the naming convention and the functions that are defined set a tone for consistency for how your team is going to find the code that they need to modify and or update over time, and it can help you make decisions if you need to separate it out to another module or feature. So I kind of blasted through that really quickly. If anyone has any questions, I'd like to, before I go into this next section, which is a little bit more higher level, dealing with the modeling and defining features, I can answer them now.
Well, my interest in features is that I want to take stuff out of the database and put it in version control. So everything we've described so far would be applicable towards that.
Well, it's important to delineate between settings, configuration, and display, and content.
Well, we wouldn't take content out of it. We might content, but let's say content types, displays, that kind of.
Yeah, and features will facilitate that.
Okay, everything we've said so far will apply to that, right?
Yes.
Take this out.
Yeah, these, like the naming conventions and things, are more from a meta level when architecting how you're applying the features tool to segment out those elements.
Okay, great, thanks.
And you mentioned custom code in there, and that's not necessarily what we're talking about now. Just want to know, you kind of embrace, if a module is not exporting its settings as into features, do you just write the code to make it work?
Well, that's a tricky question. It depends on if it's a contrib module and if you've exhausted trying to get the contrib maintainers to make it features compliant, and you don't want to write that for them, it's all about real world. Do you have, in the professorship way of putting on my hat, certainly you'd want to make it features compliant. And that would be ideal because everyone can take advantage of that. However, if you need to get this project done, say by Friday, then you'll have to make that decision that that will be an issue you'll have to maintain if you create a custom solution for it. But it can be encapsulated in that particular feature, and at least it's isolated there, and you know about it.
You can write the code that allows you to do it and put that in the feature.
And you can either make it so it's compliant with the way that features does the export, or you could write it in a way that will directly put it into the database. I advocate, of course, doing it the features way so it's more extensible and reusable, but mileage will vary.
But it's kind of a thing that we'll have to do. Like, if we want to really use features in how situations, we will have to write code.
I'll say not necessarily. Because a large portion of the contrib modules that, at least the ones that are most used, have already kind of tackled this problem. Not all of them. I'm not saying it's all just, sunshine and roses, but it's something that should be more rarely occurring than the norm. Any other questions? Nope. Okay, so feature types. So just to quickly sum up, we talked about features and modeling those features. And for the most part, the community, when I've seen talks about features, they focus on content types and the contents themselves. And that's something that everyone can conceptually understand. Well, that's still valid. I'm saying that some things to also take into account are other aspects of the system. So this stuff. Let's actually jump past this. This graphic will illustrate it better. So at the very top, the red blocks talk about what everyone is usually associated with, content types and displays. But I see it as features are also an opportunity to define module patterns and global functionality. And I'll talk about what I mean by that. So kind of redundant. Global functionality. When I talk about global functionality being exported into features, what I'm talking about are like permission matrices. How many people have struggled with permission exports in features? Some not. Depending on how many modules you have installed and the different types of roles you have, you could literally have hundreds and hundreds of permission sets that you have to maintain over time. In some cases, some teams I've worked with, we've pulled those into the individual features. And that has become a problem, especially if it's not a cut and dry thing. I need to edit this type of content. Oh, well, I also need to use this input type. Oh, and this media. So it becomes this quagmire of different related permissions. And as you're implementing a functionality that maybe is not associated to a particular piece of content. Maybe it's associated to a slideshow feature. They can conflict with each other. And over time, you'll start to see overrides. And then, what's the term? You get like this override soup. Well, I revert this, and suddenly all these other ones are now overridden. And it's because there's these interdependencies. And permissions has always been kind of like a poster child for causing that to bubble up to the surface. So I advocate creating global functions. Instead, you have centralized permissions that are managed either by one module that has the entire matrices for all the roles, or you split them out by individual roles. Really, I think it'll be a business decision of which route you go, but it allows you to consolidate it into one place, and it's external from any of the content or the particular functionality that you might need to implement for your team. Let's see. Some other examples are, say, like global solar configuration, your search configuration, media configuration. It has nothing to do with your particular content types. It's how media is going to be managed globally and universally for that particular site. So setting up that configuration in a set of features first, before even trying to look at your content types, like that can provide a foundation for the rest of your features that you build on that particular project. So global features. And again, I'm just using terms. They're all just features. Module patterns. This is where it's kind of like using features to create a recipe. Where this is most applicable is like when you're wanting to define your input types and you've got the WYSIWYG module installed and you've got media installed. And for all of those to work together, the configuration for it has to be just so. So this is a good example of creating these module patterns on top of your foundational settings. Module patterns define different sets of functionality on the site, which are not totally correlated to a piece of content or a particular function that the visitor might work with. So I would say that making these epiphanies and seeing these requires you to work on multiple projects over time. It's not something you'll be able to, unless you're really gifted and you can anticipate things. You could see what these foundational elements should be, and you build them on your first project, and then you start building your additional features afterwards. Having these two layers, one advantage also to it is that you can reuse them. Use them on the next project, refine them. If they're decoupled from your content types, you might be able to retroactively update them on other projects. And then the last is, I call it structured content, which is what we traditionally associate with features. Defining your content type fields and displays, your views, your panels, your blocks, your custom forms, and/or administration indexes. These are things that into business users will resonate with the most because they're things that they offer. So I don't know if you can see these very well. So I tried to take our cookie company example and illustrate that in these three different categorizations. So at the top, we've got those original features that we outlined for the recipe, the color taxonomies, the displays, and so forth. And then I anticipated that here's a set of recipes that probably would need to be defined. With your input profiles, your WYSIWYG profiles, your search, and maybe you have Solar implemented on this particular project. Below that, kind of echoing what we've already talked about, permissions, media files, path aliases, global image styles, etc. So this is all fine and dandy. You've got a plethora of features being generated. And prior to going live, then your team is starting to implement these different features. You may have outlined the scope of what you need to implement. And from that, you started to create individual tasks. I think it's good to look at how do these features that you're going to implement and the dependencies for them stack up with the amount of resources, staff you have, and what their specialties are. And from a workflow project management point of view, that this can, I won't say guide itself, but it'll give you signposts, mileposts to come up with a strategy and to anticipate workflow and team involvement. But that's all fine and good, but what do you do once the site goes live? What do you do when maybe there's a change that needs to happen on a particular piece, and how does that relate to the other features that you've implemented? In that case, there's some, I guess, 20,000 foot view things that can really help with that. General things like revision control, most people should be already taking that into account. You've got different versions of things to choose from, Git, SVS, Subversion. Bug tracking tools can help with you facilitating and managing your team's tasks. Bugzilla, Jira, etc. are examples. Defining checklists and peer review processes, as well as a release methodology, are types of things that can improve that to help you manage your development with features. So what you really need, though, is a master control system to help you release those features. And it's deceptively simple. Basically, the master control can either be an installation profile or a dedicated module that you have defined to manage the release of these modules, just like you would, and features, just like you would any other module. The core of it is that I'll just list out kind of the things that it gives an advantage to. Defining your default modules on initial installation. This is applicable to both deployment as well as when you're having your developers spool up their own development environments. Provides sequenced releases and updates for both your modules and features, ability to quickly do reverts, reset variables, and set variables, and manage structured content. So it's really just another module, but it's a module that allows you to coordinate that with your release schedule and your development effort. It's comprised usually of just an empty module file, honestly. All of the magic happens in the info file and the install file. So as an example, I don't know if you can actually see that, but it's just an update hook. But what you do as a team is as you're releasing multiple features and or module pieces, you'll implement your update hooks in a procedural way. They may include things like just enabling module sets or reverting and or enabling features, but they may be even more dense. It might require to correct some functionality of the database or the data set. It really depends on the particular need, but that is the general concept. You have this install module, it gets deployed with your most recent code, you run your database update, it'll generate the hooks. And if everything's deployed in a reasonable manner, it'll be what you expect. So I tried to illustrate with the different feature sets that we outlined how perhaps they could be implemented in multiple release schedules. Your initial release has all those core modules or core features defined, and those could be defined in your info file. So when you enable either the profile or the module, they all get turned on by default. So subsequently, as you go into your next release, the team has built the main two taxonomies and the recipe feature. All you have to do is set those to be enabled. You release it to your environment. You do database update. Those get turned on, and it's as you would expect it to be. Same forth and so on. So, questions? Yeah.
So Robert, can you tell us why we need update hook to turn on a module instead of just turning it on fresh?
Sure. Well, if you have multiple instances and you have several different development environments, having it centralized with one module and using that for your release process makes it consistent and also doesn't require the releaser to have any special knowledge of what it is they're releasing. In that, not that that's a good thing in some cases, but they should just know that they need to do a release, they do the update, they read the release instructions, they can validate that whatever was supposed to be released for that particular update is behaving as expected, and it's good, especially if you're dealing with sysadmins. Their job is to release those updates onto a distributed environment, or if it's a local development environment. They don't have to have all this ingrained knowledge about what's the list of commands I need to run. At least that's one benefit. Any other questions, thoughts?
Can you stack the features? So say you have a set of features for your baseline website, and then you want to throw multilingual on top.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Like just the editing stuff.
multilingual is its own little beast. So that would be, you'd have to take that into, like, that would go into the root of both that core content type. That's where it would affect, as well as the different displays, like your views and your listings. So that's a special corner case where you might have to do initial, like you'd have to do re-releases based on that of the whole set. Um,
You can't stack the sets. You can't have like one feature build out, say, the article type, and then another feature tack on the title field.
no, because that's something you'd want to avoid because it creates interdependencies.
Okay, that's what I was saying.
Okay, sure.
Okay, there are two questions. One is about what do you recommend when there are multiple content types sharing fields?
Aha,
Body,
good question.
images,
Don't do it. Like in the past, I've worked on projects where we thought, oh, let's create one feature that has all these global fields. And the problem, as you're kind of alluding to, is if you create other features based on that, even though you're creating like an instance of that field, it's still dependent on that base field definition. And so if you change it in, say, widget 2, it's going to always be overridden, and it'll show that the base feature is overridden, and you generally, it's best to put your mind at ease that you don't see a whole bunch of overridden features. It means that something is not how it should be, and that it's not like the configuration in the files, but something in the database. And if you ever have to revert or rebuild your environment, it's a good indication you're going to lose those configurations because they're in the database. What was your second question?
Second question is about like once you have basically released your features and you want to remove it or uninstall it initially, what kind of damage you see in the
Sure.
already released to the production site and now it's done.
Well,
What's the best practice to do that or what kind of damage you can?
so your question, some people couldn't hear. Your question was, once you've deployed a site with multiple features in it, what kind of repercussions could you have to disable and or remove an existing feature?
You have to remove the features from the site realizing they made a mistake or
Okay. Well, that's why having the update hooks can be useful, at least a way to centralize on fixing that quickly. When you disable a feature versus uninstalling it, when you disable it, the content's still there technically in the database. It's just hidden. So if you were to re-enable the feature, they should come back. That's the quick way to recover. If you were to uninstall the module, there's a chance that all the data would be gone. So, and it also advocates having them split out into sub-features could perhaps mitigate that risk. You might turn off a display, or you might turn off, like, you could also, that's another justification for perhaps splitting out your displays. If there's some business requirement for them to only be visible to particular users. Sure.
I don't quite understand what kind of interdependencies we want to avoid, because certainly if you have a content type and a display, those are interdependent.
Yeah.
Or interrelated.
Yeah.
What kind of interdependencies I'm trying to avoid?
Well, most of them go down to like core elements of the entity API. You've got your main content type, you've got the different fields and their definitions. You generally want to isolate those, but the displays themselves, the intention is that they're much more lighter weight, less technical debt than the main module or main feature that you'd be implementing. So although the display requires that content type in order for it to render, if you were to turn off that display or that display were to be corrupted in some way, it wouldn't affect the main guts or the data that's related to that content type. If you, I'm trying to give a better example though.
What would be an example of something definitely not to?
So let's say you got some contrib modules that provide like a view slideshow, and or trying to think of examples that have been gotchas for me. Workflow. Workflow is a good example. So sure, you can use like the workbench, but for a while there was this module called Workflow in G, I think. And so it tried to provide additional attributes to your content type. And you could certainly encapsulate that in your main, say, cookie feature. But you would want to make it so that when you enable that feature, it still functions even if that module was not there. If that makes sense. Because it's additive instead of required.
You wouldn't include turning on that module as part of your feature.
Well, it depends on what I've dealt with is I always implement workflow at the very end. So it may be an update that you implement to that feature at the end prior to your initial release. Yeah, and you would do an update until you release a new release of that module or feature to 1.1. You would include that additional code. The key thing is if you're managing everything in a revision control system, if there's a problem with that, and this assumes it's not in prod, you should be able to revert to the previous version, redeploy that, tell your master control system to revert the feature and get you back to where you were before. So that's one scenario. Sure.
The overhead features, they're not commonly accepted wisdom is you don't put too many modules on your site because you cannot build performance impact. Let's take the illogical extreme. You've broken down a very complex site with 500 features.
Yeah.
And you just turn on 500 modules.
It's a very real issue. I think that it depends on the client's budget and the amount of hardware they can afford, as well as, because frankly, you're not going to build, say, a sophisticated social sharing website and want to put it on a very small dev environment. That they just will not coexist. I don't advocate getting 500 modules, but the advantage of encapsulating features as these small units of code versus monolithic modules that you might install from the community. I usually determine that as being part of the business case for the client to determine if they can afford the amount of horsepower required for the amount of complexity that they're requesting. So it doesn't really answer your question about, yes, too many modules is bad, but the logistics that you are afforded by having these modules may reduce any bug issues you may have, or may reduce any foregone issues of having to manage that over time. So you'd have to weigh that against the cost for the ongoing monthly infrastructure required to run that type of system with those many modules. So it's not really I don't know. I hope that kind of gave it. It doesn't give you a clear answer because it's never a yes no. What else? Oh, you.
So I've worked with a lot of new users in Drupal and have introduced them to features. What is your clearest way of defining the difference between a feature revert versus a feature update?
Sure. Well, I see those terms as being things that mostly the developers would deal with. It's not something you want them to make a decision on. I have seen, there's this, I can't remember the module, but there was a team who built a abstraction layer to features where, similar to this concept of creating recipes, they created these features where their entire job was to make it like e-commerce or guest book. They extracted out the features to be business services. And those are the things that the client was exposed to. They could turn them on or turn them off, and there might be some form of cost associated with turning them on or off. But under the hood, there were multiple features and/or modules that made that service available. I usually wouldn't expose the client to saying, yeah, just to revert that feature. It would be probably bad. But it depends on your client's sophistication.
I was actually speaking about a client more of another developer who's like new to Drupal and who's like pulling down code that's being like from Git.
Sure.
And then suddenly they see that their features
are overridden.
And then they want to know, well, how do you know when to do a feature update? Because I know it's feature revert. And then I try to
Yeah.
And then you might get that.
Okay, I get you.
Work is like, well, don't forget what's in your database, just go right into the code.
Correct. Yeah.
But I found myself even getting mixed up for a while, like, what, which one? You know?
Yeah. Well, in that scenario, because I've experienced before, if I'm not sure, I'll create a new release of the feature to encapsulate whatever may be in the database.
That's probably the best.
Yeah, and of course I'll revision control it. So if I find out, well, what am I doing? That's crazy. I can go back to where I was. Cool. Any other feature or questions? Sure.
So, if I am implementing a feature and I've created it in a generates module, now that's templated in code, am I kind of expected to, on my dev site, continue developing, do my configuration in code, and whenever I have a change, I create a new feature, and then on some kind of a shared development environment or a staging server or whatever, that's where the feature lives, that's where it never gets overridden, and I never actually turn on my features module on my own website.
No. So on your local development environment, that's the green pastures area. That's the area where you're going to do all your work. You'll do your development and or customization on your dev environment, and then depending on how you've defined your release process, what we usually do is we'll then check that into our revision control system. We'll create an update hook in our master control to go along with that update, with the intention that all that just gets deployed to your centralized dev environment. You just run drush update db and or manually run the update process in the Drupal interface. It applies your changes, you test it, it looks good, and that's your release. And from that, you continue. Other developers may check in their work. They do the same thing. They release it to that dev environment. You check to make sure everything is expected. And that's your way of managing your deployments. For your local environment, you may do the same thing even locally. Your coworker or other developer submits their information into the repository. You pull it down over the top of your development environment. You do an update. You apply it, make sure no errors happen, and then you do development perhaps on top of that or in tandem to it.
So let's say I made a configuration change and it therefore shows that my feature's been overridden. I regenerate a new feature on top of the old one.
Correct.
And then the version control system just shows if there's some differences, like commit, theoretically, filing change or anything.
Yeah. So features is designed so that each individual. I don't have any examples of actual code examples with this presentation, but the features will have the way the community is designed. It is each of the different individual like modules or trim modules that you export. It's not always consistent, but they'll have a separate file for each of them. Like views and panels do have their own separate ones. Some of them are encapsulated in a single file, so it's a little confusing. But I just advocate opening them up and taking a look at them. Sure.
Okay, I'm a newbie to features. From what he just said, I do a pull from Git from my repo, and another developer has made some features that I don't have.
Mm-hmm.
I pull it down. I have these features, and then do I run update every when I open the?
Well, as long as everyone's following this deployment process, there's a difference between they're actively doing development and they're ready for it to be released. So if they're doing active development, so from a high-level workflow process, you're going to want to have a main branch that you're going to release from.
Right.
Each developer will create their own dev branch. They don't check in from that dev branch until they're ready to release it. So you may want to pull from the main branch for, say you're starting, I want to get the most recent live release. You'd pull it from the main branch and then you'd run it locally and check it out. It should function exactly how you have on whatever your release is that you've deployed onto a site. So when your developer is doing their work, you don't see their modules until they're ready, because they then need to push them to either the main branch or some branch you manage to allow a staging branch to test everything before you allow it to go to the main branch.
Okay, so let's say they merge. Okay, that's better.
Okay. Anything else?
If I created it that an existing configuration on my local dev, so I have to put it in a version control system and then actually turn it on.
Mhm.
on my local net so that I'm actually using it.
Yeah.
And that's where, doesn't it cause like a conflict or something?
Well, once look at it this way. So you've created your content types. You define your views for your simple feature. Until you export it the first time, it's not a feature. It's just in the database. Once you export it the first time, features will write it out into a module for you. You take that file and you're going to put that into like your modules directory. At that point, it's still in the database. It's not a feature that's enabled. Once you enable the feature, it's going to check against the database, and then from that point on, features will go, oh, your configurations are in this file. I'm checking that against the database. Are they the same? Your feature is genuine. It's good. If you were to go back in and say add another field to that content type, go, whoa, wait a minute. That's not in this feature. It's not the same. They're different. And that's when it'll say it's overwritten, which is a cue to you to go, okay, something's changed. And it may not be something you did, especially if you're working with a large group of developers. It could be some unknown interdependency that has caused it to think that they're not the same.
That's just not a work. Basically, I build it, turn it on, it's just work.
Yeah, and as you do changes, you'll want to do new releases and overlap that. That'll be part of what you use when you do your deployment. Okay, well, I think that's it.